All right, here we go. Sorry for the delay, everyone. Justin's name is very difficult to spell. So we finally got that sorted out. Plus, I think Baby Misanthrope may have broken the enter key on my keyboard. So kind of had to find some creative workarounds there. But here we are. We are here to talk about our follow-up to last week's stream, where we discussed the filmography of M. Night Shyamalan, the writer and director of The Sixth Sense and most recently Glass. And so we wanted to dedicate this entire stream just to talking about Glass because Glass was super awesome and there was a massive buildup to the movie coming out and there's a lot of chatter about it and it really deserves a good bit of attention, unlike anything else in Hollywood, maybe right now. I'm not sure what else I would say that about. So I'm here again with Justin Lesniewski of the Midside. So you can go to themidside.com to find his stuff. And by his stuff, I mostly mean the Welcome to the Midside podcast, which is in its 7th season. And also some really interesting articles critiquing art and culture, especially film, and a bunch of other stuff that he does, but it's all in there. So go to themidside.com and check that stuff out. Anything else I should be shilling for you, Justin?
Just that everyone should listen to our episode that we're recording tomorrow. It'll be released on Monday because that is going to be a great episode with all the stuff that's been going on. There's the Jussie Smollett stuff, the Robert Kraft stuff. There's been a lot of interesting Trump controversies this week with Trump and gay rights and then Trump going after California for energy. So there's going to be a lot of good stuff on the podcast this week.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad you guys are covering the Smollett topic in particular, because I think that actually ties in nicely to some of the themes that we see in Split and Glass and just overall in the series, right? So we may have noticed, I don't know if everyone's noticed this, but there seems to be a benefit to being a victim nowadays. I don't know. This might be a crazy theory, but it seems like a lot of people maybe want to be victims. What do you think, Justin?
I don't know. Do people like make up wholesale attacks and like pay people in a check to attack them so they can become a victim? Does that happen in a culture where being a victim isn't a good thing?
Yeah, it is hard because I'm constantly told that it's so hard to be victims and victims aren't believed and everything is just like horror from the moment you're victimized for the rest of your life. Everything is going to be nothing but terrible. And yet there seems to be an awful lot of people eager to put themselves in that category to the point that I think for the first time in history, we had an American scamming a Nigerian. So that's a new level. Stole it. Don't remember from where. Sorry. Or I would give credit.
That part of it is the combination of victimhood with second-handedness. So what you said about victimhood is correct. It is tough to be a victim if you're a legitimate victim, but it's as much about being seen as a victim as it is being an actual victim. I mean, if people were actual victims, think about that. The idea of being an actual victim, like, yeah, you know what? I think I want to be a sexual assault survivor. Well, then you would legitimately have to go through sexual assault. Nobody wants that. They want the image of being a victim. So it's the second-handedness combined with the victimhood. And that's what Jussie Smollett did, was he created the image of a victim. He wasn't actually a victim. He knows deep down he's not actually a victim. I mean, look at him. He's on a successful network show.
Yeah.
And he created the image of a victim rather than actually being one. And I think that's the difference when you have a culture where being something is seen as good and it's not based upon what you earn. It's based upon what other people see you as.
Right, exactly. I mean, when a culture values more positive things, I think you still have people who pursue those positive things for second-handed reasons, but it's much less harmful and toxic to the culture overall, right? Because if the thing that we admire is, let's say, well, speaking of Robert Kraft, if what we admire is being very wealthy and being a successful businessman, well, people, and maybe Robert Kraft is one of them, will certainly do that just so that they can have a young, hot wife, just so they can have prestige, just so they can own a football team, something like that makes them feel good about the status that they have. But if they're doing it by running a legitimate business successfully and employing a lot of people and making products people care about, and then, having a great football team, well, that's not, maybe he's going to die alone and miserable because he's secondhanded, but doesn't have a whole lot of those negative externalities like you see with the Smollett case, which is, it's a tiny incident really, right? I mean, it's it's a pretty minor thing that happened, even if it had been true. But look at the amount of resources and energy and time that was wasted just across the spectrum, right? I mean, aside from the fact that it was kind of a thing of viral interest, the police have to chase down this whole thing, right? Like the medical profession is involved because of his quote unquote injuries and all this other stuff. There's just a ton of wasted resources that result from this, this total fakery.
Yeah. And when you talk about people who, you know, amass wealth to get second-handed validation, they still had to amass wealth.
Right.
With victim culture, it's very hard, especially when we always have this thing of don't blame the victim and always believe the victim. It's very hard to say, oh, we don't believe you. And it's very easy to just claim you're a victim. Whereas when you have a culture like what we grew up in the 90s, when someone was claiming to be something they weren't, you could very easily just call them a poser because it's a lot easier to dismiss them. And what this all is wrapped up in, and how this connects to Glass to me, is the idea of narrative. You talked about all of the cultural resources that went towards Jussie Smollett. Well, that's because there were people who it was to their advantage to push his narrative. So they went with it. And the thing that's compelling about Glass is when you get to the end of it and you get post-twist, and we'll get there. I don't want to give it away right away in this analysis. But when you get there, that's what the entire movie is about at the end. It's about the narrative, how they control it, and how we let them hold us down with the narrative. And that's what makes the movie so compelling to me, because he came up with this whole trilogy in 2001, 2002 when he released Unbreakable, but it's even more relevant today.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's one of the things that I think Scott Adams has talked about, is trying to write a book that's going to be relevant 10 years in the future. Obviously, there are people who aim for 100 years or whatever, but you know, we have so much of the culture of the moment right now that I think to some extent we have lost sight of, you know, like someone says something that grabs our attention right now and we give them attention in return for that. And we very rarely even go back a few years later and look and say like, oh, was what that person said relevant? Did it make any sense? Did they accurately describe what was going on? Did they make any accurate predictions for the future? And then meanwhile, you have other people, and often they're not even in the field you would expect, right? Like this guy, like M. Night Shyamalan, is writing movies. He's telling stories. He's not a political thinker or something like that, right? But there are people who are on TV every day who are supposed to be telling us, you know, what the world is and what the future of our world is, who can't accurately predict what's going to happen next week. And on the flip side, we have, you know, people working at art who are predicting what the world is like, you know, over almost 2 decades ago.
Well, this goes back to the romanticism versus naturalism debate and the whole dichotomy between the two. When you have romanticism, you're dealing with abstract principles. And the difference is these thinkers who are making movies like M. Night and Zack Snyder and Christopher Nolan, they are dealing with abstract principles and seeing how they apply. And if you put that outwards, you can get the idea of general trends, right? History is really cycles, right? It's almost the cycle between reason and anti-reason. You could just look at all of human history through that lens. I think that's something Jordan Peterson did, right? Chaos, anti-chaos, all the bad things about him. That's probably the one great thing that came out of what he said. And with romanticism, you're looking at it with the principles. But with the advent of naturalism in our culture, people aren't looking at that. They're just looking at the concrete world and the systems that are holding us down. And then also what you've described with the 24-hour news cycle, it's very pragmatic. No one's looking at Jussie Smollett. No one's looking at Robert Kraft and saying, why did this happen? Why did this? Let's take Robert Kraft, for instance. Why is it that the small town 2 towns over from Miami is where this happened? Perhaps it has to do with division rivalries and hatred of the good and wanting to tear people down. Is it a coincidence that the AFC East rival Miami Dolphins are right down the street from where this Robert Kraft is accused of these things? It's suspicious. Nobody talks about that, though, because they just want to talk about, oh, well, he was accused of this, and there's videotape, and what is the legal ramifications, and blah, blah, blah. Nobody talks about the principles, whereas these artists are thinking in principles. Ironically, art, which seems the least objective, could be perhaps the last bastion of rationality in our culture right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, because on a certain level, you are forced to create an entire worldview and have all the different pieces fit together. Because even someone who is not super intelligent, who couldn't sit down with a book, say, about the Napoleonic Wars and understand all the ins and outs and come up with a coherent theory of, you know, what explains that period in history, we do have more of an intuitive grasp of story. Right. And when things within a story make sense. And there's trickery with visual medium, and there's certainly people miss things. But I think overall, people have a sense of when it's coming together, when it's packaged to them in the form of art, which is also why narratives in media become so powerful, because that our brain just naturally gloms onto them. And then it takes a while to convince yourself, oh, wait, that's not actually the correct narrative. So
I think that's why when we look at the current culture of attacking Zack Snyder and Christopher Nolan and M. Night, I think that's why the first major director who there was so much negativity towards was Michael Bay, because he is exactly what you described. I don't think he could pick up a book on the Napoleonic War and understand it. But on a deeply intuitive level, he understands the narrative of good versus evil and what it takes for good to win over evil. And it resonates with many people because he doesn't go deep into it and he just puts that narrative there. And that was a threat to, we'll call them the Clover Cabal, and we'll get there. That was a threat to them because there was no arguing with it. It wasn't a deeply intellectual thing. It was, as you said, it was a very intuitive thing that it resonated with people. And the only way they could destroy him was to destroy his image.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting in Glass is part of what we're seeing within the movie too is competing narratives, right? So one of the things that had you on edge more than me, I had faith. Ironically, maybe I watch Signs more often than you. I had faith it was all going to come together. But when the previews for Glass started coming out, you were a little nervous, right? You were a little nervous because there was this talk about, well, it was specialness and talking in particular about the beast or the horde, whatever we want to call them, but the villain of Split, and this apparent move toward reframing both him and Glass, who was the villain of the first movie, as heroes, right? And so talk a little bit about what you kind of saw in the preview, and then, you know, how that expectation shifted as you were sitting through the film.
Well, the difficulty here is the biggest problem the movie faces, and it's the character of Glass. Because when you end Unbreakable, he's a terrorist, right? He made a plane crash. He blew up a building, right? He killed all of these people in his own search for meaning, which is clearly evil. And that's a separate story. But in the trailer for this movie, there was one line that stuck out to me that ended up being the thematic line of the movie, which was belief in oneself is contagious. So when I saw the villain of the movie saying that in the preview, I go, did M. Night go the same way as everyone else? Did he become social justice? Now, that's at odds with the rest of his filmography, and it would be a huge contradiction. But then again, Trey Parker and Matt Stone apologized for not believing global warming on the last season of South Park. So we've been being let down a lot recently. So I saw that line, and I was like, oh, my God, I'm going to go in this movie, and it's going to destroy all of M. Night's filmography for me. But fortunately, it was just another example of studios not knowing how to market his movies, but also not being able to, because we live in a culture right now where you can't use intrigue to make movie trailers anymore. You have to put the whole plot in there so people know what they're getting before they go. But with M. Night, you can't do that. You're going to ruin the journey if you do that. The first movie of his that really suffered from this was The Village. They had no idea how to market it. So when people saw it, it was more of a drama than a horror movie. That's what people were really upset about. And then they rationalized it, complaining about the twist.
Yeah, I think The Lady in the Water had that to a lesser degree, because the trailer was very tense. It didn't reveal too much, but it was very tense, and it made it seem like it was going to be primarily a suspenseful movie, and it's not really. Not really that. But The Village is suspenseful, but not horror.
Right. And they're marketing off of emotion, and that's the problem. They're trying to get people in the theaters by emotionality. This goes back to what I was just talking about with these abstract principles and having more intellectual art. where you can have an emotional experience with it. Glass is very emotional at a certain point.
Yes.
But when you're primarily marketing based upon the emotions, it's no different from saying go on this roller coaster because you're going to get a thrill out of it.
Right.
You know, part of the reason I like Disney versus a Six Flags is Disney has story, right? They build an immersive experience around their theme park. I still enjoy Six Flags, but that's more just, it's purely physical. It's purely thrill based. And it's the same way they market movies nowadays. I mean, think of what Marvel is. Marvel is what's the next great exciting thing. It's not, you're not going for the story. What's the story of Captain Marvel? You can't tell me. We don't know.
There's a cat in it, I'm told.
There's a cat and she's a female superhero and yay, female empowerment, and she doesn't know who she is. But you don't know anything. Oh, and aliens. But you don't know anything else because they market based on emotionality and they tell you the plot, but the plot they're telling you is pure emotion. And that's what they try to do with his films. And it'd be like imagine trying to market a Twilight Zone episode based on pure emotions.
Right. Yeah, I have to say, I like that they put a line that revealed the theme of the movie in it, because that, for a long time, I've wished, like, man, if someone gave me like a summary of a movie, I wish instead of getting a plot summary, because a lot of times I don't even want the plot revealed, I wish I had like a theme summary. And sometimes even that wouldn't be right. Sometimes I don't want to know the theme either, because that's part of the journey, is discovering what the theme is, but at least pointing you in a general direction. And then maybe also like the genre category is helpful. But yeah, I definitely struggle explaining to people, because I know I tell someone like, oh, M. Night Shyamalan's really great, you should watch some of his movies, and they're like, oh, I saw The Sixth Sense and I had a panic attack. And I'm like, okay, that's not irrelevant, but just trust me, it's gonna be fine. Like, watch his other movies. Like, maybe don't watch, you know, actually there isn't even another one I would say that would give you a panic attack. So like, you know, whatever. It's really hard for directors who don't just make the same movie over and over again to like put that kind of stuff out there, right? Because there is so much of like expectations and people wanting their expectations met and not being psychologically open to being taken on a journey, like we talked about last time, right? People who have this preconception of what the story is going to be. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody, but I actually did a pretty good job setting it aside to go and see Glass. And I'm glad that I did, because some of what I suspected would be in there was in there. I think we correctly identified the theme of Split, and that Glass confirms that, but it goes in a direction that is very different than what you would expect. Because like you said, we would think that Glass is probably an irredeemable character, right? And we would think that it's not as obvious that Kevin Wendell Crumb is irredeemable, or let's call him the Beast as the villain.
Well, that's more complicated, because I think
it's more complicated.
Irredeemable. Did you hear what I said?
Yeah, parts might be irredeemable.
Right.
I do think there was an interesting piece to the story of like I don't know. So what was it we talked about before that had there was some movie that did a really, really bad job of talking about like Suicide Squad, I think it was, the theatrical version versus the extended cut. The theatrical version, they both kind of have this thing that's just like, even bad guys have love or something, right? Something like that.
Yeah, it was they made the theatrical cut of Suicide Squad very naturalistic, in the sense that it wasn't about what you do, it's about who you care about and who you love, and as long as you're part of a family, you're still a good person and can be redeemed.
Yeah, something like that. And then the extended was a lot better, was like a little deeper, but it still was that basic idea of like, yeah, like even bad guys need love. And to me, I really like that element of Glass, because I think this might be the first time that I actually saw this really well done. Yes. And so what we end up seeing in the movie is, well, we were going to talk about the significance of the number 3 a little bit in the movie, right? But so we have the 3 superpowered people, right? So we have Glass, who is the super intelligent but physically super fragile. We have Dunn, Bruce Willis's character, who is physically super strong, and he's not dumb or anything like that, but mainly he's physically he's super strong. And then
I would describe him as more blue collar. So he doesn't necessarily worry about the deeper meaning of life and what his purpose is. He just sort of does what he has to do. He has a job that he thinks is a good job, and he just wants to help people. He's not worried about the greater significance, sort of how we think of blue collar, country, Southern in the traditional sense.
Yeah. And he's very driven by the relationship with his son, who was the person who believed in him in Unbreakable, right? And to a large extent, Unbreakable is about the relationship between him and his son, even more so than, his powers or anything like that.
Right. Again, we see this, and we're going to see this with Kevin Wendell Crumb as well. It's again M. Night and his significance with the innocence and positivity isn't the right word, but positivity of children.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The willingness to believe in,
greatness.
Believe in extraordinary things, right? Yeah,
right.
Believe in greatness. I think that's the right way to put it for sure. Right. So then we have the Beast, which is the split personality guy played brilliantly again by James McAvoy. And he was the abused child who developed dissociative identity disorder and then ends up creating this identity that has also basically super strength. And he's kind of based off of an amalgam of different animals in a zoo. And, he seems irredeemable because he kidnaps girls and then eats them.
because they're innocent and pure. That's right. Important.
Because they haven't suffered.
Because of their goodness, he wants to kill them.
Right, exactly. Well, I wouldn't say it's goodness. This is where I think that like the subtlety like makes him redeemable here, because he's not it's kind of, maybe it's almost like the difference between good and great, right? He thinks they don't have the potential to be fully human because they haven't suffered. Okay. But they don't think that, but he doesn't think that makes them good. Right. Like, even though, as we see kind of in the story, like they're not bad people. This isn't Revenge of the Nerds, right? There's nothing that these girls have done that makes them in any way deserving of what happens to them from our perspective. And then, so the other three that you don't really realize are another trinity in here until you get into the movie are
maybe even till the end, honestly, in that last scene in the train station when they're sitting there.
Yeah, then it's really, really clear. I think it was pretty clear when they all showed up to me at the same time, at least the second time that they all showed up at the asylum. Yeah. But so each one of these heroes or hero villain, superpowered person, we'll just say super person, has a normal person who cares about them. So Glass has his mother. Dunn has his son, and Kevin Wendell Crumb has the girl from Split who he let go. And that was another one that was like an alarm bell, right? Because when we were looking at things in the preview, we were like, uh-oh, because it really seems like we're like, you could kind of, I forget how you could tell, but you could kind of tell watching it where you were like, I don't think she's here to like fight him, right? And that's revealed like quite quickly in the movie, right? They announced that the Beast has been caught. Her principal at school tells her, and she's like, oh, you must feel way better now knowing he's behind bars. And she's like, yeah, I've thought about him a lot. And you're like, oh no, we've got some Stockholm thing going on. But it turns out that's not what it is, right?
Right. Sorry, I wasn't sure. I thought you were going to keep going. Yeah, it's not that at all. It's really the complexity of it. And this is where I'm saying that some of the characters within the Beast are irredeemable and some aren't. She, I think, is the first person. I don't even know if the therapist in the last movie in Split understood it. She's the first person who understood why he had dissociative identity disorder. And she saw through to Kevin Wendell Crumb more than anyone else did. And that's what they were differentiating between.
Right, exactly. And that was, for me, probably the most moving part of the whole film was, okay, so I don't know, is it time to skip to the spoilers, which we told you guys, I warned everyone. Spoilers galore in this one.
So I think we should back up a little bit before we skip to the spoilers, because I think there's some important setup here beforehand. And we touched on it before when we talked about narrative and expectations. And I think M. Night was really playing with expectations in this movie, because this is a superhero franchise. And in these superhero franchises, what do we come to expect in the final one? I mean, even in Batman versus Superman, which is one of my favorite movies, there's still a giant battle between Batman versus Superman, and then an even bigger battle with Doomsday. Right? So we've come to expect these huge, epic fights. And you go into this movie and you're like, oh man, this is going to be Glass controlling the Beast to fight Dunn to find out who is superior, and Glass is going to try and take over the world. And you just expect this huge action movie. And it becomes a much more psychological movie. And M. Night refers to that in the movie. He keeps talking about, and I think this was a reference to Die Hard, by the way. He basically keeps talking about how, oh, Bruce Willis, you're going to go fight the bad guy at Nakatomi Tower at the end of this movie. And he says that over and over again. And that's what we expect, right? We expect to go to Nakatomi Tower and have a huge action sequence where the good guy beats the villain and proves that Americanism is superior. I mean, that's literally Die Hard. And he was definitely playing with that. He's saying that this typical narrative goes back to that. And I have this guy in here, and he sets up our expectations. But by setting up that expectation, all of these reveals are different. We have the 2 twists at the end. And this even continues with the 4th character that we have, or the 7th character we have to introduce here, the doctor, where she's really the one controlling our expectations as well. So one, M. Night, the director, is controlling our expectations, but she is as well, where she takes the 3 of them and she has them in front of them. And there's an entire scene where all she does is undermine them and tell them why they're not special. They don't have these powers. And she convinces them. And that's where the movie first changes and becomes a psychological thing. And if you're not paying attention, you're not realizing that's where it's going.
Right. I love that scene because you have this very intense style of directing that he adopts there, where you saw this in the preview, I think, so it's probably not a mystery to people, but you have this very soft woman with this very round face, very nice makeup done, dressing in this very like conservative but feminine way. She even has a little bit of a lisp. So just really, really just kind of like over the top femininity in some ways. And then on top of that, they're in a pink room, right? Or at least a room with pink lighting. And then you have these 3, like to some extent, masculine archetypes sitting in front of her, literally in chains. And then they have physical means of controlling them, to some extent. But the real way, like you say, that she's controlling them is by breaking them down psychologically and making them believe that they are nothing special. And that
goes back to the victimhood thing, where she's saying it all goes back to a traumatic experience you had. You had to use a traumatic experience to create the idea that you are special. And if I bet you all of you can trace it back. And with David Dunn, specifically Bruce Willis's character, he starts going back to a memory of almost drowning in a pool, and he convinces himself that's why he can do these superhuman things. And
right.
To me, that was interesting, and I'd actually like to get your perspective on this because I think you're more of an expert on it. Is my layman's understanding of narcissism isn't that how narcissism develops? You have trauma, and then you convince you, in order to protect yourself, you raise up your level of self-importance, and you make it so everything is about you, even when it's not, because in order to make yourself feel like you're not unimportant, you have to be super important.
So official narcissism, they think actually develops before like 6 months of age, and that it develops out of neglect. So that's more extreme than maybe some of the cases that we would label as narcissism from what we see in the culture. But in general, you're right that it's a response to people being in an environment where they're not getting something that they need, needs to be provided to them by someone else, right? So when you're a baby, like you need to be cared for by adults around you, preferably your parents. So when a baby isn't responded to immediately, when they're crying, when they have diaper rash or they're hungry or any of those kinds of things, then their brain kind of rewires around, makes it extremely urgent for them to remain the center of attention and to make sure that they can actually like be taken care of. And then it seems to get stuck kind of at that level as they get older, and they maybe never even can, like they're not even sure if it's treatable, right? You might not even ever be able to kind of grow out of that and become really self-sufficient.
So that's interesting. That little piece is what I was missing. They need to be the center of attention so they can get what they think they're not going to get otherwise. So their traditional means of getting the care they need don't work. So they have to develop this other method to get the care they need.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
And what's interesting about this scene in Glass is the way psychology is being used in this false way. I wonder if M. Night's even doing this on purpose. He must be, because as we said when we talked about Lady in the Water, his knowledge of internal family systems seems to be there. So he seems to be well-versed in psychology. It's almost like he's showing how they use pop psychology to mess with your heads, because she seems to be arguing narcissism, but she's not really. It's a misunderstanding of it. Having a traumatic experience that messes you up isn't going to make you believe you're special or anything. If you almost drown like that, like David Dunn did, that's more going to make you fearful and not want to go forward in life, which it's the opposite of what she's saying, right? I mean, I think this is something I even touched on last episode. It's this weird thing where what they teach is selfishness actually isn't selfishness, it's selflessness. It's the same thing here, where she's teaching that because of his traumatic experience, he needs to believe he's a superhero, but really his traumatic experience is what kept him from believing he was a superhero.
Correct.
His whole life he's like, I'm not special because I almost drowned in a pool. And she's telling him it's the opposite. I mean, that scene is literally the definition of gaslighting, is it not?
Yeah, she's absolutely gaslighting him. Yeah, and this is where a lot of people's interpretation of the movie has gone awry. I think, many of the themes are just very clear and come across very clearly to people. But I think a lot of people are distracted by the fact that, and this was present in Split as well, right? The fact that the brokenness of Kevin Wendell Crumb did in fact make him a superhero. It did in fact give him powers, right? So what does that mean? Does that mean that the movie is actually saying that being broken is the path to greatness and strength, right? And so another way to view the movie besides these sets of three is actually two sets of two. So one way to view the movie is that David Dunn is facing off against the Beast. The Beast is the one whose brokenness made him strong. David Dunn is the one whose brokenness created his weakness. Right. So David Dunn had physical strength regardless, but he didn't believe it, and he had limitations. His limitation is water, right? Water being his weakness because of this traumatic event.
It seems like M. Night hates water, huh? That was the weakness in science. It's the weakness here.
I would just guess it's a Christian kind of holy water thing, maybe. Yeah. But yeah, it's also water also often symbolizes the unconscious, which is what it is in Lady in the Water, right? So here that would also make sense. So you have those two facing off, and then you have the cerebral match. So that's the physical matchup. Then you have the cerebral matchup, which is Glass versus the psychologist. And so really you have these two parallel battles sort of taking place between two, they're fighting the same fight in a sense, because there's the physical fight and there's the mental fight. But then you have two different extremes within that sort of power set, right? And what he ends up, and then the other piece that was relevant to saying the source and the pain. Oh, right. I remember now. So the other thing that I think people miss is at the beginning, the Beast is frustrated because he thought he was going to create the awakening, right? The awakening that in the end Glass actually creates, right? But his strategy to create this awakening was to go and transform into the Beast in front of homeless people. Right. So because he literally believes that brokenness is the superpower. So
it's like Los Angeles. It's Hollywood Boulevard.
So he's intentionally going around trying to find the most broken people that he can, because he thinks that they are going to rise up and emerge like him as this powerful entity just because they're broken. And he's frustrated because it's not working. They keep doing it and nothing's happened, right? They keep eating more and more girls who haven't suffered. And he keeps revealing himself more and more to the broken of society, and nothing happens. And so that in and of itself demonstrates that there's something wrong in his assumption, right? But it's not. But at the same time, the film's not a wholesale rejection of the assumption, because as we see, something about the experience that he went through did turn him into this thing that is more than typical humans. So the character that really makes that come full circle for him and puts that into the correct context is the girl. I don't know why I can't remember her name, but the girl who was in Split, the one who he let survive. And she shows she shows, like, even within Split, she kind of shows the positive side of, like, or what should we say, the non-pathological side of being broken, right? Because she's very competent in the kidnap scenario in Split because she is being sexually abused by her uncle, right? She knows crazy. She knows how to like be patient and careful and like stay calm in these situations and be smart.
Well, and also
but she doesn't know how to fight back.
Right. And something I want to add is if you go back and watch Split, it's actually crazy how he sets up the ending for that character, for the Beast, for Kevin Wendell Crumb in that movie by how she treats him. Because if you look at how she treats him with love and care to try and bring out the good side of him, that's ultimately where she ends up with him in this movie. And that's sort of his redemption as he dies. So it's interesting the way that that's set up even subtly in Split.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of know at the end of Split that she is probably going to turn in her uncle, who has also become her custodian, sadly, over the years since her father died. And that's confirmed in Glass. And so when she finds out that the Beast has been captured, she goes to the asylum specifically to see him and basically to tell him thank you. But it's interesting because she isn't saying thank you to the Beast. As you note, she goes there and is she the only person who brings out Kevin in the movie, or does the psychologist do it at some point? I think so.
No, she's the only one who does, because that was set up in Split where she learned that. That was the whole purpose of her arc in Split, was she was the one who learned to communicate with Kevin Wendell Crumb. And I think now looking at the denouement of Split, we have to realize that part of the reason he lets her go is not just that the Beast believes that because she's broken, she is more redeemed. That's certainly the large element of it, but it's also because Kevin Wendell Crumb on a certain level understands that he's only doing this. The Beast is only there to protect himself. So if Kevin Wendell Crumb were to kill her, then he would just be doing, it would basically be, I mean, this is what love is, right? He sees her as an extension of himself.
Right. So that there's no need for all the alters who are there to protect Kevin don't need to attack her because she's not a threat to Kevin.
Right. So the end, because of Glass, the ending of Split actually becomes even more complex. It still stands on its own, but it becomes even more complex. It has this added layer to it because of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. So she goes and because I do think this is also important, right? Because if you look at it and you're like, oh, this on the surface, this is like Stockholm syndrome. You know, that's like the very superficial way to look at it. Or it's just, you know, excessive appreciation for like the one, because, you know, she found a positive outcome out of the bad things that happened to her, which is also part of the lesson of the movie. And all that to some extent is there. But it is important that she goes there and she talks to Hedwig, right, who is the little boy who thinks that she's his girlfriend. And he has some cute, like, silliness about that, right? And she's
even that is part of this whole story, because Hedwig is basically who Kevin Wendell Crumb was when he started being abused. So that's how he would formulate the understanding of the world where he's stunted at his 9-year-old or 8-year-old self or whoever it is. So when he says, "You're my girlfriend," that's revealing that Kevin Wendell Crumb is in love with her.
Right. Yeah. And so then she does talk to actual Kevin, and gets him to come out and tells him like basically her update on life. And then, you know, they kind of talk for a minute, but Kevin basically runs away, right? Because he doesn't like to hold the light. He doesn't like to be there. He likes to let all these alters protect him because he thinks he can't handle the world. Right. And that fear is what has driven him to the point of actually like having these superpowers. But of course, if you take the perspective that people can't really have literally different people inside their heads, right? Like everyone inside of his head is actually still Kevin to some degree. So Kevin actually has this enormous strength inside of him. He just doesn't know how to embrace it in the context of his own core identity. And that's the arc that he eventually gets to by the end. And it's interesting to see how, because the two people who are important to getting him there are the girl, of course, but also Glass. So it's really the interactions that Glass does very little to Dunn. He doesn't have to do very much, right? He just he basically just says like, hey, a lot of, he did it in the first movie. And in this movie, he's basically like, a lot of people are going to die if you don't, you know, bust this door down, basically. which is enough because, like you said, classic American blue collar hero. Even though he doesn't believe that he's actually super strong, he's got to try because people are going to die if he doesn't. Right. And then you have the very unambiguous superhero moment for him of him literally battering down like a solid steel door with like a gazillion locks on it. Right. So there's no ambiguity left at the end of the movie that like, no, actually this guy is super strong and all this stuff about like
bends the bar.
Yeah. And bending the bar, I almost want to say, I'm like, what was it made of? Like other people, like, I'm sorry. Cause I thought about that when they were showing the video, right? Is this video going to convince everyone that this is real? And I'm like, I totally, because obviously they did fake it for the movie. So of course you can imagine like how that might be fake, but breaking down the steel door is like very unambiguous, which is a great moment after where he knocks it down and then he looks up at the security camera with just this like very, like speaking of like masculine archetypes, right? It's like, in contrast to all of our like Marvel heroes who like to varying degrees have to be like snarky and like throw out one-liners and
there's the undercut. Marvel has to undercut with the humor. They undercut with the humor.
Right. And there was no humor in that moment, but there was also no need to say anything at all because his actions, spoke for him and showed everything that needed to be said. So I thought that was a really nice.
Like it's a movie and it's communicated visually.
Well, there's also that.
Well, to go back to what you're saying about the two parallel storylines here with the Dunn versus the Beast and Glass versus the Doctor, I think it's important to note here, and I think we can move towards the two reveals here. I think it's important to note that as I was talking about expectations and narrative and what we typically expect, M. Night uses this narrative to distract from this narrative. And what I mean by that is he makes it a purely physical battle of good versus evil to distract from the psychological battle going on between Glass and the psychologist, when really this is the plot of the movie. And it's not until the reveal that you realize this isn't the plot and this is. And that's why for me, the second twist of the two, which is the reveal of who the true villain of the movie is, right before it happened, I was just like, oh yeah, she's the villain. Not because it was obvious from what was going on, but it was obvious from a narrative standpoint. The only way the movie could finish was if that was really what was going on. Because what happens is, through much of the movie, Glass is supposedly he's sedated. That's what they think. They think he's sedated. And that makes him not in the movie. I mean, a lot of the movie is
him blinking.
Right. Samuel Jackson blinking. He's going to win an Oscar award for just blinking for 45 minutes to an hour. All right, that's a lot of it. So they build up this idea that Dunn's going to fight the Beast and he's going to fight him at Nakatomi Tower. But what ends up happening is you find out Glass is not sedated. He frees the Beast. He frees Dunn. And they go to fight, but they fight right outside the institution. And as they're fighting
in the background.
With what?
With the tower in the background.
Right, with the tower. Well, the very obviously CG'd tower in the background, by the way. I don't know. That was probably the worst part visually of the movie. You could tell it was low budget at that point. But that's a minor critique. But yeah, with the tower in the background, which is, I think that's probably a subtle nod. He's probably being, I think that's M. Night being visually humorous there. The battle's going on in front of the institution, and you're sitting there and you're going, that doesn't make sense narratively. He set this all up. Why is he setting this all up if narratively it's going to climax here? And then you realize, wait, that can't be the climax. And then the other three show up, right? Glass's mother, David Dunn's son, and Casey is her name. Casey shows up. And then you go, wait, there's more going on here. Then you have the first twist reveal. And the first twist reveal is that Kevin Wendell Crumb's father was on the train that David Dunn was on. So then really Glass created both of them.
Yep.
What do you think?
Which I think is interesting because I think both twists are actually the same, right? Because all along we think that his Glass's superpower is that he's super smart. But then he basically tells us, no, actually my superpower is that I make superheroes. And he made David Dunn by crashing one train. He made two. He made David Dunn, and then he left Kevin to be in the clutches of his mother and to succumb to dissociative identity disorder when his father died in the train derailment.
Right.
And then
the second twist, or the second part of the twist, we'll say, is the hardest to understand. Because the biggest critique of this movie is that the biggest possible critique of this movie is that Glass is no longer a villain, even though he committed these terrorist acts. He is redeemed and becomes a good guy. So the question then becomes, how can M. Night, as an honest person, make a movie where a terrorist becomes a good guy? And the only way you can do this is by having the psychologist be the villain. And she's the villain because she is part of this massive conspiracy that suppresses superhuman powers. And whenever these superhumans arise, they kill them.
Which has literally been going on for thousands of years.
Right, thousands of years. So how does this make it so Glass isn't really a victim and that Glass is really fighting back? Because he's fighting the system. What that means is the only reason he had to commit the terrorist acts to begin with is because there's this overarching conspiracy that's making it so you have to have a giant train crash for David Dunn's powers to come out. Because he's been convinced his whole life he's not special and doesn't have powers. So Glass has to do these things because he believes, in Unbreakable, he believes that he is special. Glass. And they're telling him, you only believe you're special because you need to, because your bones break all the time. But he knows innately within himself that he is special. It's this feeling he has of his own identity. And he only has to go to these extremes because he's working against a giant conspiracy that's making it so we doubt ourselves and we don't embrace our powers. So in the end, he's redeemed because he takes the actions to show that he is right, and him being right shows that how corrupt the world actually is. And I think that's a really subtle point that people miss when they go, oh, well, now we've made the terrorist the villain. That makes it a bad movie.
Right. And I think that
the hero, sorry.
I think it takes it to another level too in terms of the relationships with the three non-powered people, right? Because then it says, well, his Glass's mother's loyalty to him, for instance, despite the horrible things that he did, is also because she saw that he was special. And she tells him that in the movie, right? She's like, you don't listen to any of this. Like, you are special, and it has nothing to do with the fact that you're delicate, right? And God, I'm gonna tear up just thinking about this part. But the flashback to his childhood was so well done and so hard to watch. And I know that's just emotionalism, and that's not there isn't anything super deep in there that redeems him becoming a terrorist later. But it was a really good move to show him as a kid. And in that particular scene where you see, this kid whose bones break just from bumping against a wall, practically just wants to have a normal kid experience and go on the tilt-a-whirl. And he tries to be smart about it, right? He puts big animal padding around and all this stuff, and he's having a great time. And then one by one, the defenses he put up fall away, and he just ends up like a broken mess on the floor. And his mom is screaming at the guy running the I mean, it's really hard to watch.
It was hard to watch for me when he goes on it, and I go,
you know what's gonna happen.
Those animals are gonna fall, and then they fall, and I'm just like, oh my god. Yeah. And just knowing that his bones are it was very difficult to watch.
It's so well done. And then adding to that the fact of what he's been doing, because he's been in this asylum for a long time, and he doesn't necessarily although he is fighting the system, I don't think he knows, right? I don't think he has an inkling that this Clover cabal exists. But he figures it out, I guess, very quickly, or at least enough. He knows enough, right? And the subtle clues are there for the audience too, right? Because this woman comes in, and she kind of contradicts herself. She comes in and she says, I specialize in people who believe that they're superheroes. But then she also tells them, if you guys are so special, how come no one else in the world is like this? If this is a real thing, then how come it's only you? You really think you're that special? And it's well, wait a minute. I thought you just said you specialized in people who are like this. So which is it, right? Are there other people who are like this or not? And then, of course, she's not really a psychologist at all. She's just a paid gaslighter, basically. And they have this almost even more twisted idea that it's more humane to convince these people to torture them psychologically and gaslight them into believing that they're not special than it is to just keep executing them when they arise. Even though, of course, at the end they do execute them, right? They end up drowning, done. They shoot
in a puddle.
Kevin.
Oh my god!
In a I know, it's so hard, right?
Well,
so
it's
hard to watch. So
the end of, as you're saying, the end of the movie is they're fighting outside, and the Clover Cabal shows up, led by the Doctor, and they kill Kevin Wendell Crumb. They kill David Dunn, and Glass brings about his own death because he taunts the Beast, who the Beast just basically punches him a few times, which the dude's got so much frail bones that, like, I'm sure all the shards from his ribs went into his lungs and his heart and everything.
Yeah.
But when they're killing, right? That was the most emotional for me, especially when they killed David Dunn, not just on the level of this is a character and an actor that I love and seeing his heroic character die in this way, but the pure symbolism of this is a man who is great, who they're trying to convince him he isn't great, and he's been trying to fight for his greatness, and he ends up dying in a puddle in a pothole because some giant conspiracy shoves his head in there. That's so tragic. Yeah. And then watching Kevin Wendell Crumb die when the one person who's actually showed him love in his life is there, that's tragic as well.
It's at least more redeeming there because Kevin holds on to the light at the end. Sorry, that's the part that made me cry, so now I'm being ridiculous.
It's not ridiculous, though, because this is the one time he finally has the strength to see the light because somebody else believes in him and he gets killed. Like,
yeah, I think, but is it after he gets shot or is he Kevin when he gets shot? I can't remember. I think he is Kevin. I think he is Kevin when he gets shot, actually.
I mean, that would make sense because that would be more narratively compelling. So I would think he did that.
Yeah, but then he chooses to stay. So that was, well, I think they run through some personalities, but then in the end, he's like, no, I think I'm good. Like, dying as myself. God, I only saw this movie once and I'm like so emotional about it.
Well, it's good. And then, here's the question I have for you, which I'm trying to remember because we only saw it once. Who's the one who notices the tattoos on the? So what happens is they're all fighting, right? Glass is on the bystander. He gets his ass kicked by the Beast, and then Dunn and the Beast are fighting. The Doctor shows up. The mother, David's son, shows up. Casey shows up, and then all of these guys show up that you assume are like the FBI or something, and they've got guns and everything, and they're the ones who shoot Kevin and drown David. But somebody notices they all have Clover tattoos on them.
I don't know if one of the characters even notices. The first time it's shown to the audience is the guy who assassinates the Beast, the guy who shoots him. So you see his wrist as he's like aiming or something.
Right, and then you see the wrist of the guy who's drowning David too. You
see that, yeah. And then you also see it on the wrist of the psychologist, I think, when she asked Dunn to touch her hand so that he can see the truth.
Right. Because, yeah, I forgot about that part. Yeah.
Yeah. So he knows but I don't know if he actually got enough of a reveal. Like all he got was enough to see that there was a massive conspiracy. But there weren't really any details about what it was. And then the psychologist tells Glass, like, it's part of the truth or something. Like she tells him enough that when he dies, he knows also. But I don't think any of the other three, the normal three, know anything.
Right. So we'll get to the normal three in a second. But what I want to talk about first is I want to talk about what the tattoo means. Then I want to talk about what Glass does and how that leads into the final two scenes, actually seeing the conspiracy and seeing the response to the conspiracy. So the tattoo was something that we talked about. And it was actually my friend on Twitter, Christopher Chupnick, who is a sci-fi author, who actually nailed I'm 100% convinced he knows what the clover means.
I agree.
We were trying to figure it out. We were like, why is it a 3-leaf clover? What does that symbolize? And he tells me, he goes, a 3-leaf clover is completely ordinary. And that's what it is. These people are the ordinary, and the extraordinary is a threat to them. And what makes this so compelling is that is 100% what our government does. Critique Ayn Rand for what you want, and I think you want to bring that back at the end, Ayn Rand in horror movies and these type of genre movies.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Because you didn't like them. But critique her all you want. What she understood is there are two ways to survive in this world. You can survive on your own ability and your own merit, and you can be productive, or you can be unproductive and survive based upon your weakness. And those who survive based upon their weakness can only do that by tearing down the people who survive based upon their productivity. And that is what this movie gets 100% with the clover symbolism. This conspiracy only exists. These people can only have these jobs in this life. Their life's purpose is only to destroy the people who are extraordinary. If they did not believe that was necessary, they wouldn't have any purpose in life. So it's an entire conspiracy created to hold other people down. And who becomes the most important people in the world then? The conspiracy.
Right. Well, at heart, isn't that what every actual conspiracy is about? Right. Yes. I mean, because that's the whole point of needing a conspiracy and needing to operate in the shadows. And when I left the theater, I think I texted you right away just saying, I can't believe that he made this movie like now today. Right. Speaking of this, 20-year prescience or whatever, but, whether you believe in the Q phenomenon or not, there's no question that in the public consciousness today, the idea of a conspiracy like this is like, it's in everybody's head as like a definite possibility. Like that's what the world feels like. Right. Like you keep seeing things like Elizabeth Holmes, like people who are lauded as the next great whatever. They're a prodigy. They're this, they're that. They're going to change the world. And then you look into it and it's like, oh, she's just a rich kid with connected parents who like got everything handed to her. And the whole media backed it and promoted this as though it was real, and none of it's real. And no one even bothers to check if it's real, because at the end of the day, it's not even important if it's real. All that's important is that certain people control the levers of power, and then therefore they control the story.
Right. And this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, and it goes back to naturalism versus romanticism from last week. In the beginning of this episode, we talked about Kraft and Jussie Smollett. Look at Kraft. Look at the Patriots. Look at Deflategate. All of these, Deflategate is literally the definition of a conspiracy. If you want to see a real life conspiracy, that's Deflategate. They made up something. They came up with all this evidence. They convinced people using narrative that Tom Brady deflated footballs to cheat because he really couldn't be extraordinary. He really could not be great. That is a conspiracy. And it's the same thing. Oh, now is it a coincidence that Robert Kraft has been accused down the road from the division rivals Miami Dolphins after the Patriots have won their record-tying 6th Super Bowl? Is that a coincidence? I don't believe it's a coincidence. But here's the difference to me between story and real life. My question in real life has always been, who are the true believers of this stuff, and who are the ones who just sort of follow along and have bought into the narrative? I think in real life, there are just more people who have bought into the narrative than there are actual true believers driving the conspiracy. And it appears to be a conspiracy because it becomes easy for a small number of people to execute things on a large scale when you have people just following mindlessly. Whereas in the movie, we have the ability in the movie and in movies in general to tell these stories and exaggerate these conspiracies to make them seem real. And to me, what the real issue is, and this is why I have the passion I have, is naturalism versus romanticism. When we look at the end of this movie, what Glass does is romanticism, the character, and what the Cabal does is naturalism. So what happens is we find out the entire time Glass has outsmarted the conspiracy by taping everything that's going on and sending the tape or the video or whatever we want to call it in today's digitally recording to his mother, Casey, and David Dunn's son. And at the end of the movie, they release that into the world. First, we have a scene with the conspiracy saying, like, good job, we did it, blah, blah, blah. Then we have the scene at the end in the train station where they start to see people waking up because the video has been released. This is literally naturalism versus romanticism. The story of naturalism is what the Cabal is teaching us, that we are not special. We've convinced ourselves that are special. It's all just the system turning us into victims, and we all just suffer. Versus romanticism, which is belief in oneself is contagious, and you are special, and you do have abilities, and to embrace those abilities no matter what level they're on. And it's all about the choices you make. And I believe that is a very intentional dichotomy M. Night draws at the end of the movie. And that's why, to me, it's such a brilliant movie.
Right. And as you noted, the shot before the last scene in the train station showing the building, it's a train station, but it's a famous public works government built Depression era building.
Well, they cut
in Philadelphia.
Right. They cut from the meeting of the conspiracy and he pans over to a government building, correct?
Yeah. Essentially a government building, public works thing. That's very iconic as well. And so there's your visual symbolism there. There's also an interesting discussion, and I believe it takes place between Glass and Kevin, or Glass and the Beast, about the relationship between romanticism and realism, because one of the things the psychologist shows to try and convince them they're not special is scans of their brains showing an abnormality. And what Glass points out is that doesn't prove what she thinks it proves at all, because of course there's an explanation for what happens, right? And this is where I think the Christian element for M. Night is also very important, because the people who like to gaslight Christians and treat Christianity as like borderline insanity like to point to things like young earth creationists, or have this vision of the idea of a God who just comes around and just does crazy things and there's magic everywhere and like everything's crazy and unpredictable. But what the vast majority of Christians actually view the world as is a thing that operates according to natural laws that was set up by God. Right. And so, of course, there's an explanation for these powers, of course, because they're not actually supernatural. There are people with extraordinary abilities operating within the natural world and according to natural law and according to all of those things. And so, of course, there's something like in their brain, like maybe making them this, like, of course, there's like a physical explanation. Of course, there will always be an explanation for all of these things. And it doesn't disprove what let's put the kind of like, I fucking love science crowd in that naturalism bucket, right? It doesn't prove what they think it proves. When they go head to head with Christians. And that's why like these kind of debates, again, I'm not a Christian, but those debates between the kind of typical like big name atheists and Christians like fall so flat, because they're not even, they're similarly gaslighting their opponent, right? They're straw manning at the very least, they're straw manning their opponent. So I think that gives them a very interesting perspective.
Again, this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, and it's abstract principles versus pragmatism or versus materialism. And I mean that in the philosophical sense. These atheists are also coming from an irrational perspective because they're coming from pure materialism.
Right.
Oh, if it's material, there's nothing special about it. It's just material. But I would compare healthy atheism to being very similar to healthy Christianity. And what I mean by this is, I think I may have mentioned this last episode. I say it all the time, so I don't remember when I say it. It's something I heard Dr. Drew say, and it's the most brilliant thing, like to describe my own atheism. Because I've always hated saying I'm atheist, because I hate these militant atheists you're describing who are very materialistic. And that they know there's something wrong because they need to prove their atheism by disproving Christianity.
Right.
Somebody's Christianity is not a threat to me. Unless they're going out there being like, oh, let's make all these laws based on Christianity. It's not a threat to me. Believe what you believe. If it gives you comfort and makes you understand the world better, it's fine. And the commonality I see here is Dr. Drew said, you don't have to be a Christian or believe in God to do the 12-step program, because all you have to do is believe there's a higher power than you. That's all it is. And healthy atheists, like myself, if I could be so arrogant, I just believe that there are things beyond my understanding in the world. Do I believe that it was created by an intelligent being? No. But the world is complex, and there are things that are beyond my understanding that I will never understand. And that's what the higher power is. The universe is a higher power than me, and it has a structure, and it has a system where things can be explained within. And that's the same thing as Christianity. They just attribute that to an intelligent being.
Right. Yeah, and I think that resonates through a lot of M. Night's films. But we are past our hour point. So let's hit on that last topic, which was, as I mentioned after the last one, we're Ayn Rand fans, right? I don't know if objectivist is too strong of a word, but we like Ayn Rand a lot. I hate the term
objectivist because we're living in a collectivist society right now. And when you say objectivist, even the objectivists assume that means you believe everything they believe.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just like, I don't want to be lumped with a bunch of people.
Labeled, man. I don't want to be labeled. except for conspiracy theorists. You can label me that. I don't care. Right. But so one of the interesting things that Ayn Rand said, because Ayn Rand really was all about art, and her philosophy was only concretized in order to support her art. But she hated horror. And I always thought that this was very interesting because almost every objectivist, I think every objectivist except for one that I know who got involved in film, actually loves horror. And then a lot of the top people that I would say are most compatible with Ayn Rand's aesthetic view, not to say that they're objectivist, but that her view of aesthetics, romantic realism as the best form of art, whatever. So many of these people come out of horror.
Well, Zack Snyder?
Zack Snyder is an example.
Started with a zombie movie and is now doing another zombie movie.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Coming full circle there. So I think there must be something off there, but because I don't know that much about film and I'm not a big horror consumer myself, I will ask the expert, what do you think is going on there?
I think you are right. I think Ayn Rand was wrong. Oh no, burn me at the stake. I think she was wrong because, and you don't need a huge knowledge of film. What is the genre where you can most concretize good versus evil, and you can essentialize good versus evil and have monsters that really represent evil and heroes that really represent good? Let's go back to the zombie thing. Why is Zack Snyder doing zombie movies? Because what is he about? At his core, Zack Snyder is about individualism versus collectivism. Give me a better representation visually of collectivism than zombies.
Yeah.
Right now. You can't, because there isn't. And that's why horror is great. I think this is going to be very harsh of Rand, so I'm sorry, Rand fans out there, but I think there's a little intellectual elitism on her part going on by not liking horror movies, because it can be seen as very, very base. Oh, you mean I'm going to concretize collectivism by just having these monsters that are decaying and they're wandering around and they just
eat brains.
People? Yeah, and they eat brains. If you're looking at that, again, on a surface level, you're not going to see the brilliance of it. But Ayn Rand, you came from communist Russia. That's what they literally did. The collectivists ate the individualist. How do you not see how that's brilliant? So I think it's just, especially in today's society, horror is where you can most get away with being romantic.
Right.
Because people just dismiss it. They don't look at it on an in-depth level. Even Saw in the beginning, right? Saw degenerated into this materialistic torture porn. But in the beginning, it was really a meditation on what does it mean to be alive and to take life for granted. And is this guy really evil? Because he's trying to say, I had cancer and I took life for granted. So now I'm going to punish people who don't take life for granted. So why Saw was compelling in the beginning was it had that romantic ambiguity in it, as far as the ideas behind it. When it became more naturalistic is when it became terrible.
I have to say, every single person who is a Saw fan tells me that's exactly why they like it. Like, they like it because I haven't seen it, but as I understand it, he always gives them a way to escape, but they have to give up something, right? Like, you have to cut off your arm or do something like that. And people who aren't willing to do that, it means actually they don't value their life enough. Right. And that's like what they're kind of confronting people with. There's a similar thing in Seven, which is a movie I like quite a lot. With like, not everyone has an opportunity to escape, but I want to say the woman who represents vanity, right? He like cuts up her face and she'd be fine. She has a phone. She could call 911, but she'd rather die than live with like a scarred up face. I can relate. I'm sympathetic, but like still, you should probably place the phone call, think it over, kill yourself later if that's the right thing to do. But anyway, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's kind of ironic that Ayn Rand took that position because at the time that she was writing her magnum opus, sci-fi was in this category of lowbrow, right? And everyone believed sci-fi was in need of rescuing because it was just
they did rescue sci-fi. Look at sci-fi now.
Right, exactly. Which is what we talk about with John all the time. It's like the elevation of sci-fi has been, there's been some good parts about it. I love Dune. It's one of my favorite works. Atlas Shrugged is arguably sci-fi in some respects. But
it is sci-fi. Atlas Shrugged is sci-fi. There is no generator. He creates a perpetual motion, perpetual energy generator. That's definitionally sci-fi.
I don't know if having one piece of equipment that is science fiction makes the whole story science fiction, because not that much hinges on there's like a fascination with the motor, but not that much hinges on the existence of it, right? Like you could replace it with a really beautiful painting, and she wants to track down who painted this really beautiful painting, and it would still work, and then it wouldn't be remotely science fiction, right? But anyway, whatever, different discussion. But the point being, it was a lowbrow form of art that she took to like these literary heights, but for some reason she's not open to that same possibility in horror. And it could just be, there are people who don't like horror, right? Apparently that's like a very important question to get right if you're going to have a relationship with someone. If you both like horror movies, you both dislike horror movies, that's like a really strong predictor that your relationship is going to work out. So there's something there. There's some there.
But all the girls who like horror movies are usually really weird and like cut themselves and shit. I'm being
Yeah, let's look at the comments. So yeah, someone in the comments mentions that zombies are basically the NPC memes, and that's 100% correct, right? Yeah. That's exactly it. And that ties, that kind of ties it all together, right? It's like that ties together like the mass conspiracy, right? And like the mass part of it being not people who are in on the conspiracy, but people who just buy into it. And allow allow this cultural rot to kind of take hold. But
right, because if you buy into the narrative and you believe the conspiracy, in a good horror story, in a good zombie story, that will lead to your death because you'll make some sort of mistake where you're following the group or you're not thinking for yourself, which ends up with you getting bit.
Right. So don't get bit. That's the moral of the story. Don't get bit, and don't feed the beast. Don't go, like, if you want to keep Netflix long enough to watch Zack Snyder's new movie, I won't hold it against you, but I canceled my Netflix account. I'm done, like, paying for these, like, terrible comedy specials that promote values that I despise. And I will only go see movies by people who are making good stuff and ideally making it on their own, like M. Night is doing. So he could go all Woody Allen and put out a movie a year for the rest of his life, and I'll see all of them, even if they start sucking. So that's my suggestion.
Follow people that take the risk for you. I see a lot of movies because I want to know what's good and what's bad, and I can help people because I can tell you whether it's worth seeing or not.
That's a good way to root it into a shill. Yeah. So listen to Justin's podcast. Welcome to the Midside. They review trailers every week. Most of them suck, but he suffers this stuff so that you don't have to.
But the dictionary. We need the origin story for the dictionary.
Yeah, things have gotten a little off of the rails. That was the really great part too. I did like that line of with what was, I forget what it's called, but they were saying it was like some sort of special issue of the comic. That what the story was going to be, and then Glass is like, "Oh, Mama, this was never that. This was always an origin story." Yeah. And it's like so great because it's true on like all these, like it's the story of turning him into a hero. So it's an origin story for him. It's like a second origin story for the other two. And then on top of that, it's the origin story for all of the heroes that he's now created by revealing what the Clover Cabal is up to.
Well, yeah, I would like to drive home that point by saying two more. One, really the whole thing is a better version of Infinity War. And what I mean by that is Infinity War was the Thanos movie, right? Every Marvel movie features a different character. It was Thanos. This was really the origin story for the psychologist.
Yep.
You could do a series of her going out and killing different superheroes now. You could have a whole movie series if you wanted to. He won't. He said he's done, but he could. And then the other thing is, and we can end on this. I think this is a great way to end because I'm going to be arrogant here. It was the origin story for you, the audience.
I like it. We're going to end it. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Justin. Wait, how do I end it? There you go. The big button that says stop broadcast. I ruined it. Okay, bye.